Hello, I'm Kurt Lidke, Executive Director of Klamath Film. You just watched Dulce et Decorum Est, a fascinating perspective of a veteran as told through a famous World War I poem by Wilfred Owen. With us is the film's director, Walter Haussner. Walter, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me.
So first off, I should ask if you yourself are a veteran or if this was inspired by a veteran that you know.
Yes, I'm a veteran. I did 20 years in the Air Force. I was an aircraft maintenance officer. I learned of this poem probably when I was in my 20s before I was in the Air Force. And it's always meant a lot to me because it, it de-shellacs what war is. I would say it's a deglamorizing depiction of warfare. And the title, which Dulce et Decorum Est pro patria more, means how sweet it is to die for your country, which if you hear and read the poem, that's not what it's about at all. There's a large bit of irony in that title. So, I'm a veteran, and that poem has meant a lot to me for a long time.
And it's also ironic in that the author actually died weeks before the end of World War I during an attack as well.
He did a week before the armistice was signed. He died. And the poem was published posthumously. One thing I wanted to do is that there's a Wilfred Owen Association in England, and I wanted to basically run the film by them before putting it out. And Wilfred Owen nephew's widow is the president, Elizabeth Owen. Peter Owen was the nephew of Wilfred Owen. Anyway, I wanted her to see it. I wanted her approval or any notes, whatever. And we just got a wonderful response. He said that Steve's performance was the best she's ever heard. And that especially meant a lot to me because, the cream of British acting has done readings of the part. I mean, if you go online, you see Christopher Eccleston, these Kenneth Branagh, and just for her to say that means more to me than anything, really.
Right. Well, when I first watched this film, before I got to the end where it has the explanation and the connection to Wilfred Owen, I kept thinking that this sounds so oddly familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. Like I'd heard it somewhere before. What made you want to incorporate a World War I poem into what comes across as a representation of a Vietnam veteran experiencing flashbacks? I guess it kind of shows how, a war is a war is a war in terms of the human impact and toll, right?
Yeah, and this is a continuous cycle of war. I mean, it seems like we're in never-ending wars, and I did Vietnam because the chronological age of the actor of Steve, he'd been in his 60s. A World War I veteran would have been in his 60s and in the mid 1960s. So we wanted to be true to his age, and of course, a grandfather. There's chances he could have a grandkid in the field. So that ties in with some of the images there, the photograph, and
yeah.
But go ahead.
The structure is interesting because you start off with an archival broadcast of a radio broadcast from Vietnam, and then
that was a friend of mine I was stationed in Cairo, Egypt with. He actually did that broadcast.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, yes, it's a recreation, but it's Sean Mahan, a friend of mine. He was a major in the U.S. Army. He did that for me.
Okay, but it's intended as a representation of a broadcast from Vietnam. So
absolutely.
It could be looked at, again, going back to the kind of the timeless thing and the impact of veterans. It could be looked at as present day, a Vietnam vet looking back on experiences, kind of reliving experiences in his mind, or as you said, a World War I veteran recounting this poem during the Vietnam War era. Which direction were you trying to kind of focus the film towards? I take it shooting it in black and white was kind of an added motif to give it more of that kind of historic feel too.
Yes,
right?
yes, it was. I wanted it to. I wanted in both Vietnam and World War One. In Vietnam, of course, we lost 58,000 men and women over the course of 20 years. And that's incredibly tragic. But if you look at World War One, and World War One was like the forgotten war for so many years. I think it's come back into prominence maybe during the past 10 years, but there were battles that the British Army fought, and within a 48-hour period, the casualty rate was twice what happened in Vietnam over 20 years.
Yeah.
The Battle
More
of the
people died in day one of the Somme and the
Yeah.
British than all Americans in Vietnam combined.
Absolutely, yes. And that was in my thoughts when we made this. And PTSD is is a major factor, and it's a byproduct of every war. Fortunately, we're in an era where it's more widely accepted. If you look at World War II veterans, there's always almost a cliche, the World War II veterans never talked about anything. They just sucked it up. But there was damage done because of that. Damage to them, maybe damage to their kids. And I'm glad we're in an era where it can be discussed. And
Sorry.
That's fine. And
my phone is going off. There.
No problem. And we're probably still, obviously, still lagging in treatment of it, but at least it's a recognized factor now. Whereas in the past, it wasn't. There was a film that John Huston did during the war, Let There Be Light, which about PTSD, and it was banned for years. The War Department was what it's called at that time, but not even touch it. So now it's touchable, which is good.
Yeah. Well, the sound effects that you used were really interesting. You say that you used archival World War I recordings for the background noise, and I am a student of history. I've always, as you said, I've been very fascinated with World War I more so than World War II in the last couple of years. I'm not sure if that's a trend or maybe some of the recent films that have come out, like 1917, that have kind of sparked a new interest in that era and the causation of it, and how World War II was really kind of an extension of World War I. They took a pause to regroup, and then World War II kind of was
Yes.
part two of it.
It was in so many ways, yes. Uh-huh.
Yeah. But utilizing those World War I effects was interesting because it becomes a little distracting during a course of the film when you're trying to listen to the poetry. But I get that was intentional, right? To show kind of how the lingering memories of war experiences can be so vivid even many years later, and the sounds and noises and experiences can come back to be almost kind of overpowering and overwhelming as this person years later is still trying to get on with their life, right?
It's true. I don't know if you remember when Saving Private Ryan came out, there were World War II veterans who had never talked about things with their family and who saw the film, and there were some serious after effects for some of those folks. Yeah, and so, these things can linger. They don't go away. And I've read of, soldiers having nightmares still 40, 50 years later. Yeah.
It is certainly not an easy poem to recite. It's a beautiful poem in a way, but it also times itself in a very specific era because it does mention gas attacks.
Yes.
And according to the Geneva Convention, post-World War I, no one was supposed to use chemical. Of course, it's happened in history, but no one was supposed to. It's a hard poem to recite and read, much less to evoke emotion while trying to remember it. But the way that your actor does is really well done. Did you use a teleprompter for it, or did your actor memorize the whole thing? Because they did a really remarkable job in the delivery. But I'm guessing there are probably at least a few flubs in there, right? Because it's not an easy poem to state.
Most of the flubs were on my part. I got the sound wrong or something. I would say he made maybe one flub, but we shot it. I think we had 5 takes. And probably 4 of those were because I had a problem with the sound. That was the entire crew. So I was having to do I was a dolly grip. I was the camera person. I was, when you're trying to pan out and dolly in at the same time, sometimes it's really problematic. But one thing we wanted to do, his delivery of the poem, I wanted to do in one take. I didn't want to cut because that can indicate, okay, maybe you flubbed it somewhere. But that was important to both of us to do it in one take. And he was great. Yeah,
it's a very difficult poem to just read on paper, but the way that the actor that you got for this evokes the emotion. I'm not sure if he was a veteran himself or not, but you can see it in his eyes and you can feel it in his voice, the impact. And either that's a sign of a really good actor or someone who has lived it and experienced it and is evoking those memories in the delivery of it. Because it was really powerful, the way that he presented it, I thought.
Oh yes, he wasn't. He's not a veteran, but he can channel. I will tell you that. And even Elizabeth Owen, when her remark when she emailed me back after seeing it, she says thinks Steve must have had an incredible amount of pain and suffering in his life. I hope that's not the case. I hope it's just because he's a great actor, and he is a great actor. So, but she recognized what you're saying also.
So you shot this last year when we were still in the grips of lockdowns and trying to figure out things to do. What was the motivation to want to make this film? Was it because this was something you could do with a very minimal crew and cast and still be able to be able to film?
That's part of it. It's part of it. And while Steve and I were making another film, I showed him Christopher Eccleston's performance of this, and he's, he said, "Wow," and it's very powerful. So, I think that was percolating in his mind and my mind also. And after a while, he said, "Well, why don't we just do this? But let's not just do like I said, not a reading behind a podium. Let's just make it a little bit more cinematic and do it in the form of a flashback." And so we, I mentioned we shot it in a Saturday afternoon in September, and it was just he and I together. I had a friend. It was shot in Jacksonville, Oregon. A friend was renovating her kitchen. She lives in a house built in the late 1800s, and it just seemed like an appropriate setting. And I like monochrome. I like black and white, and I like haze and atmosphere. And I know there's a lot of smoke in it, and that was the intention, was that to be a part of his flashback also, the smoke of the battlefield, and just the haze kicked up by doing his labor in that room sort of morphed into this battlefield smoke. So at least that was the intention. So
Yeah. Give us some more background on Wilfred Owen as far as why his works are so highly regarded as a representation of the war experience.
I think because it's so visceral, really. I know when I was growing up, we a World War I poem I remember being familiar with, being exposed to, like in the 5th or 6th grade, was in the Flanders Field. And that's a great poem, but it just doesn't have the gut punch, I don't think, that Dulce does. And I think it, over 100 years later, it's still meaningful, is because it's still true. And it deglamorizes it. It just goes for the jugular. It is so direct, but at the same time so eloquent, especially two sonnets together. And I just can't imagine a better, I say war poem, but also anti-war poem.
What made you select this particular poem? Were you already aware of it, or did you have to go out and kind of discover it and realize that this would work really well to be adapted into a film?
Yeah, I'd admired the poem since probably the 1980s. I bought a book of World War I poets, and that's the one that jumped out at me. There's a Anthem of Doomed Youth. There's some other poems in there and some Siegfried Sassoon poems, but that's the one that just has always jumped out at me. And wow. And so that's what we wanted to do. Yeah.
Okay, great. So what do you hope that people take away from watching this film?
The impact of war, that there's nothing glamorous about it at all. And I say that as a veteran. And that we as a world, as a country, have been in this cycle of unending war, if you think about it, since almost since 1776. I mean, there have been very few times where we weren't at war somewhere or had some kind of military operation. It may not be a full-fledged war, but we had interventions here and there. It was going on through the 19th century, 20th century. And nowadays, even during the past 20 years in Afghanistan, there is active, very intense fighting going on. And just watching the news, I mean, maybe a little bit of coverage. And of course, it's winding down now, and the troops are more or less out of there. But we're in intense warfare for 20 years, and in some ways, you would have never known it.
It's like we completely forgot for years that we were even at war, unless you knew someone. Like I have some friends I went to college with that ended up enlisting and got sent to Afghanistan, or were in Iraq, and so it was real to me. But then there was kind of this disconnect. Like I'm not a part of the Vietnam generation. My parents were, but I've heard them talk about how at dinner time everyone gathered around the TV and you watched the war live on TV from the dinner table. And that's just the way that Vietnam was. And then that led to a lot of the anti-war sentiment and pushback, to whereas in the wars we've been involved since, you really don't see or hear much unless they want to really ramp up the patriotic flair for it.
It's true. It's true. I mean, there are incredible documentaries that have come out of it with, documentarians embedded, in operational units, but just the day-to-day coverage in the field, like even in World War II, the Ernie Pyle, radio transmissions, or Cronkite, Dan Rather. I mean, their coverage during Vietnam, and the body counts. I mean, every day. Has been pretty much invisible the past 20 years.
It was really interesting to watch your film and hear some of that, because I'm someone who has been a collector for a long time, working in both music and film, and I've sought out archival World War II recordings, because I find the old radio broadcasts, like hearing a British broadcaster broadcasting live during the Blitz, and there's bombs being dropped over London, and they're narrating what they're seeing live on the radio. That sort of thing is fascinating, the kind of thing that we just don't get anymore. And your film, I feel like, taps into that experience that perhaps people have forgotten the harshness and the destructive nature of war. And so I appreciate your film very much for kind of bringing it back around to the realities instead of the cleaned up version that we see either in Hollywood films or in whatever makes it past the censors for news broadcasts.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you. Talking about, going back to World War II, it's amazing. I mean, you had A-list directors directly involved with the war, and part of the Signal Corps, and the naval photographic units. I mean, John Ford was when the Japanese. Yep. He was holding the camera. Then when the Valve dive bomber drops the bomb and the camera's knocked out of his hand, I mean, that was Ford shooting that. I mean, it's like Christopher Nolan being in Afghanistan. I mean, he was probably the top American director. And you had, William Wyler flying in the Memphis Belle. I mean, if he were to be shot down, I mean, he was of Jewish descent, first generation, and he had relatives in France. I mean, my gosh, talking about putting it on the line, and he's holding a 16 millimeter camera inside of a B-17 flying missions. I mean, I can't imagine that happening today.
Yeah. The closest that we'll ever be able to experience it, and it's something I've tried to share, through virtual reality. They've actually there was a BBC radio broadcast where they were flying aboard an Averlet Lancaster over Germany, and they recorded it. And they've turned that into a virtual reality experience that you can kind of walk through the aircraft as it's flying and listen to the historic footage and whatnot. And so I've shown that to some teenagers to kind of get them the experience of what it was really like. But that's as close as we'll probably ever get to experience it, unless you're actually a veteran or active military member and you're actually on the ground these days. So I like how your film kind of shows the after effects, because a lot of us may not have been active military, but perhaps we knew a veteran or had a veteran in our family, or maybe our grandfather fought in World War II or something along those lines. And I had that experience with my grandfather, who never wanted to talk about it ever, until one day, after enough poking and prodding, he provided the most incredible stories. But this poem and this film kind of shows how a veteran can let some of that out that has been kind of stuck inside, and they don't know how to express it. And I hope that your film is able to be a showcase for veterans to be able to communicate more and provide more dialogue. Is that a direction that you hope that people can spark a dialogue from having watched this film?
I hope so. Yeah, I've entered in some other festivals that are more geared towards veteran filmmaking, and that was my intention. Yeah, but I really hope so, and also just let them know that this is part of basically a continuing, that they're not alone. I mean, their fathers or grandfathers or great grandfathers. It seems like we've always been in this. We've always been going through this as a country, so they're not alone in that.
Yeah. Any final thoughts?
No, it's just an honor for Dulce to be selected for this film festival. And I look forward to being there.
Well, thank you for this film and for joining us. Dulce et Decorum Est will be screened on Sunday, September 19th at 3:15 p.m. in our Southern Shorts category and available on demand all week long. Walter, thank you so much for the time, and thank you for this film.
Thank you, Kurt. You have a great day.